Hello, everyone. Welcome into the Guilty as Charged podcast. I am your host, Alex, for this episode of Bolt Breakdowns, here to talk about everything Chargers schedule release, which obviously came out last week. They did the anime video, which was great again. Steven and Tyler broke that down on Thursday's episode of the pod, but I just sort of wanted to, have a couple days to simmer down on the schedule and not overreact too much one way or another. And see what I really thought about it and what I really thought about the Chargers' chances this year in some of these games, and then answer your guys' questions so we can kind of break it down right here. So without any further ado, let's get into the first question, which came from BTIV at BRT86 Chargers on Twitter. Simple question: what's your very early record prediction, and are you going to any games this year? As far as going to games, probably not, considering I will be in a foreign country still doing my thing over here in medical school. Wish I could go, but don't think I will. Steven and Tyler will be at the games, though. They'll have a presence there. Maybe I can make it out to a game sometime in December, January, but we'll see if the chance allows for that. But yeah, let's get right into the Chargers schedule, I guess. This is, talking about record prediction. I look at this schedule, and to me, I see 10-7. I know some people will be on the more optimistic end of that. Some people will be on the more pessimistic end of that. But to me, this is a game where I think this is a schedule, again, where the Chargers are going to win some of the 50-50 games that, could go either way. I do think they'll probably drop a game or two that they shouldn't. We'll talk about that in the schedule a little bit later. And then, ultimately, like, the higher ends of the schedule are, do the Chargers finally win the games they have to win to really truly be like a division contender, right? Are you going to steal one from the Chiefs, or are you going to lose two to the Chiefs, right? Are you going to win the game in Denver, which has been like this nightmare for them recently? As far as this particular schedule, the two things that I am not in love with are they have the bye week, week 5. I know some people will say that, hey, like, they've had the bye week later in some other years, and those years didn't go super great. But still, my thinking on that is I think you want the bye week to be a little bit later. So, like, let's say it's wedged in between that, like, Packers and Ravens game you see, and, like, between week 11 and week 12 you see here. That would kind of be like an awesome time for the bye week, because maybe you get a player back for that Sunday night game. Having it so early in the season where the team, in theory, is supposed to be at its healthiest, right? I just think that that's less utility to a bye week. And I know some people will say, hey, the Chargers were actually injured later on in the season, right? More so than at the beginning. And that's a fair point. But again, that varies from year to year. But, like, I just think having the early bye week probably is worse for them than having it later on and having that, like, little buffer period in between some of these crucial games down the stretch. But that's just how I see it. Not that it's going to, like, cost the Chargers the season or something, but I would have liked the bye week to be later. And then the other thing, as I'll say, is I do think there are a lot of tough opponents that they're playing at home, right? So they'll get the Ravens at home. They'll get the Cowboys at home. Of course, one of the Chiefs games at home. Their first Denver matchup is at home, of course. They get the Dolphins as the season opener at home. So a Sunday Night Football game against the Bears, et cetera, et cetera. So I think a lot of their, like, the Bills also in the Peacock exclusive game, that'll be at home as well. So from that standpoint, I do think a lot of the games that the Chargers, like, might not necessarily be favored in, it's good that it is at home for them. But then on the other side of that, I do think there's some games that the Chargers should win that are tougher now because they're on the road. And I would specifically point to the Packers game at Lambeau in November, and then, which is an early game, and then at New England at Foxborough in December against two really good coaches in Bill Belichick and Matt LaFleur, who, to me, have a chance to give Staley some, like, real problems in terms of how he coaches his defense, not necessarily because they have great offensive teams, but just because of the ingenuity of those coaches in finding a mismatch. We saw it in 2021 with Bill Belichick when he went against Brandon Staley. So, yeah, I think those are going to be two difficult games on the road as well that maybe the Chargers would be favored in, like, on a neutral field, but those games could get more difficult. So, ultimately, my prediction, to answer your question, that was my long-winded way of saying 10-7 is kind of where I see the Chargers as a whole this season. Let's get to another question here from Armand Andrade, who asks most surprising win and loss. So let's go back to that schedule over here. I think if you talk about like surprising win, I think that there's going to be a lot of preseason hype about the Jets, and I still think the Jets are going to end up being a good team, potentially a playoff team in the AFC. But the Chargers don't traditionally do super well with traveling from West Coast to East Coast, but I could see they get 2 weeks of primetime Herbert right in a row, and I could see him just kind of outdueling the Chargers and leading them to a win there. So if you're talking about a game that the Chargers shouldn't win but end up winning, I could see it being that Jets game in particular. Not that I think the Jets are going to be bad or anything, or that Rodgers is even going to regress or any of that stuff, but I could just see Herbert, kind of playing up to the competition in that game a little bit, as we've seen so many times with Herbert in primetime during the regular season in particular. So that's a game that strikes me as a shouldn't win but could win type of game. And then shouldn't lose but could lose type game. For me, I keep going back to those Packers and Patriots games. And, like, the Patriots, again, like, they scare the shit out of me. I'm a coward. Like, I'm sorry. As long as Bill Belichick is coaching there and as long as the Chargers keep losing to the Patriots, I'm probably going to pick them to lose to the Patriots. I think that that's a game that is an early game, traveling to the East Coast, Foxborough in December, all of these factors combined. Even though the Chargers have a better roster, they have a better quarterback, they have a better offense with Kellen Moore in there, that's a game that I can't, like, put 100% my stamp on, like, oh, they're winning that one. Like, that's a game that keeps me up at night when I'm looking at this schedule personally. So I would put that Patriots game under should win but could lose. Let's get to another question here. Jesus Sainz asks, would a dominant week 1 win change the outlook of the schedule going forward? Yeah, I mean, like, I think my answer to this question is, like, sort of course, right? The starting 1-0, like, I would assume has a lot of historical context to making the playoffs than starting 0-1, right? I would assume that you see that stuff. Not that CBS or, like, Fox puts those stats up there, but, like, anytime you can get wins early in the season, like, it's great and increases your margin for error later on, right? And I think in particular, you look at the Chargers September stretch going into that bye week, I think the Chargers have to be 3-1, like, going into the bye. Like, I think you have to beat the Dolphins, you have to beat the Raiders, and then I think you got to get one of those road games at least against the Vikings or the Titans, preferably the Titans because of AFC Conference tiebreaker later on in the year. But, going 3-1 or 4-0 in that stretch would be such a lift off of this Chargers team where it gives them margin for error against the Cowboys, against the Chiefs, against, the Jets and the Lions and the Packers and the Ravens in that stretch. But if you're 2-2, right, like, now suddenly you're kind of like just trading wins and losses potentially in that stretch versus having, like, that 2-game advantage, in the win-loss column. So I don't know. That's just sort of how I'm, like, viewing the schedule right now. I think the Chargers need to start hot, and that includes that Dolphins game. If they really have a dominant effort with a lot of their guys healthy and then go into a Titans team, go into Tennessee against a Titans team that's, like, again, not supposed to be super good on paper, but it's early in the season, they could do some damage. I think it would give them some confidence going into that game. And then you have the Vikings, which, probably turns into, like, a shootout type game simply because the Vikings don't necessarily have the defensive pieces for that, and the Chargers defense is kind of unproven too. But I believe in Herbert, outdueling Kirk Cousins, despite that game being at Kirk Cousins' favorite time of the day, which is 1 p.m. 1 p.m. Kirk Cousins is an absolutely terrifying player. But I do believe the Chargers can win that one. But again, yeah, I do think if you start 0-1 with the schedule as a counterpoint to your question, then, like, suddenly you have to win the Titans game to stop going from 0-2. You have to win the Vikings game to kind of get back in the positive shift there on the schedule. So yeah, like I do think that week 1 game is going to be really important litmus test for, where the Chargers stand in the AFC, but also for tiebreaker and a lot of these other things that we talk about later on in the season. And again, like I've said a couple times, the margin for error gives you later on in the schedule. This comes from Skymaster at Carter Kripe. He says, even though the games are tougher on average, I think that most of the teams are weaker than the Chargers from a power rankings perspective. We should beat most teams on our schedule. Yeah, I think if you do power rankings like at this time of the year, any article that I've seen has the Chargers somewhere from 6 to 10. So there aren't a ton of teams that are like better than the Chargers from a power rankings perspective. The only counterpoint I'll give to that is I think there's a lot of teams that are in the same range as the Chargers, right? Like I think the Cowboys, you could debate who's better between the Cowboys and Chargers, but that's going to be a tough game. The Vikings, I think, are a team that's going to be in that same type of range. The Dolphins are probably in the same type of range. So I do think there's not a ton of teams that are wholesale better than the Chargers, like the Chiefs on the schedule. But I do think there's a lot of teams that, hey, they have better injury luck than the Chargers, so they end up being better than the Chargers. Or the Chargers have better injury luck than those teams, so they end up being better. Or, something with coaching, right? That pushes one team over another. So I do think that the Chargers, just strictly from a power rankings perspective, are better than a lot of these teams. But football is not played based on power rankings, as we know. So yes and no, I guess, is kind of my answer to your question. It was less of a question, more of a thought. This one comes from Roberto Castellan, who says, what's the best case scenario for the Chargers this season? Do you think there's any chance they win the West? My public stance on winning the West is this. I will not predict it until it happens. Me, Steven, and Tyler did the schedule prediction, we did the predictions in August last year before the season started. And I was the one who had the Chargers as the 5th seed, and I had the Chiefs as, I think, the 2nd seed in the AFC. Was wrong on that. I was really big on the Ravens last year and really wrong because Lamar got hurt, unfortunately. But, I think that this is a scenario where if a couple bounces go the Chargers' way, the higher list of outcomes, they can win the West. If you steal a game from the Chiefs, if you sweep the Broncos like you're supposed to, and, you don't drop dumb, home or road games this season, then yeah, if the Chargers get a little lucky, then I think they can win the West. If you bake in some Chiefs, they don't get lucky in some scenarios here too. And again, not going to predict it until it happens. And the Chiefs have a rough schedule too. So there's always the chance that maybe the season goes south for them. At the end of the day, they have Patrick Mahomes and Andy Reid. And I personally am not going to pick the Chargers to win that division until it happens. I would love to see it. But for me, it's not on my list of outcomes for the season right now. I think the Chargers, until something categorically changes about that division, are playing for a wild card, more or less. But again, would love to see the Chargers contend for that division. Just not in that mindset that they can right now, or not so much that they can't compete for the division, but that they will win the division. If you were doing odds, you would have the Chiefs as the odds-on favorite, and the Chargers, Raiders, and Broncos trailing by quite a significant portion, probably in that order, I would assume. But yeah, so overall, if we're just talking about strictly wins, best case scenario, I think you can get to 12 or 13 wins, right? You get a couple bounces that go your way. I think whatever way you kind of portion it out for the Chargers here, this is an 8 to 12 win team, right? Meaning if you lose a couple of the games that you're supposed to win, then you're going to fall towards that 8 number. If you win some of the games you're not supposed to win, you're going to fall towards that 12 number, right? If you get a little better injury luck, then you're going to fall towards that 12 number. If you have slightly worse injury luck, you're going to slide down a little bit, right? that's where I think the Chargers are kind of as a team. I'm not going to put them as like a true division contender with the Chiefs in there or like a Super Bowl contender yet. But again, like seasons can go haywire, and some teams, again, outperform expectations and some teams underperform expectations, which is a thing we'll get to in a later question. Let's see. I did see a good question in here somewhere. This is a good question from Sir Booby Miles. What team on the schedule is projected to be good but will be sub 500 by the time we play them? This is an interesting question just because I think when you look at the schedule, and I also will do this the other way, like what team is kind of going to like outperform expectations this season. You look back at the 2022 schedule, and I think that you saw some teams like the Broncos and Raiders who got serious hype going into last year, and then they're on the Chargers schedule and they end up kind of falling off, right? And then you saw teams like the Jags and the Seahawks last year on the Chargers schedule, and those were supposed to be walkover, easy wins for the Chargers. The Seahawks end up being a good playoff team. The Jags end up being a really good playoff team, in my opinion. Of course, we saw what they did to the Chargers in the playoffs, but they also played a really competitive game at Arrowhead too. So there's always teams that kind of go like up and down here. So team that's projected to be good, but isn't good by the time we play them. Interesting question. I hesitate to say this, but I think there probably should be some doubt creeping in about the Bills. Not saying the Bills aren't going to be good, but the Bills have been like the AFC East, champion every year. You bet on Josh Allen. Their division is a lot harder now, right? Like you do have the Jets and Rodgers in there now as a factor. You have the Dolphins, who improved a lot this offseason, and we kind of talk about it every year, but like if you can keep Tua healthy, then the outlook of that team is a lot better. I don't think they're going to have a cakewalk in the AFC East like they have had the last few years. I do think this is a division that comes down to the wire, and like in the process of all these teams kind of beating up on each other, like, yeah, I could see, say, the Patriots sneaking a win off of the Bills or something like that. So I don't know. Like, I don't know where the Bills rank in terms of like schedule rankings across the league. Like, I still think the Bills are going to be good. But if you're talking about like, could I see the Jets winning the division or something? Could I see Miami winning the division? I could, right? And we talk about Josh Allen, who towards the end of last season and in the playoffs, after his elbow injury, did not look very good. So if you bake in some Josh Allen regression into that equation too, again, this is sort of like your question was sub 500. I don't think the Bills are going to be sub 500, but I also don't see a ton of teams that are just going to like be projected to be good and stink by the time the Chargers play them. You can talk about the Lions. The Lions actually have like a pretty difficult stretch to open up the season. I think they play the Chiefs. They play Seattle. There's a game at Lambeau, at Green Bay in there early where you're kind of going to find out who the Lions are, more or less. So like that's a team that I think the league could be really high on in Detroit that kind of ends up falling off a little bit. Wasn't in love with their draft either, to be totally honest with you. So I don't think that the Lions are going to like fall off, but I don't think maybe they'll be as hot as they were towards the end of last season, where they reeled off, 7 out of 9 wins or something like that. So I don't think the Lions are going to quite be in that position. But I don't necessarily think they're going to fall off either. So those are the two teams I would guess I would look at in the Lions and the Bills as like not going to be sub 500, but I do think are maybe won't meet the expectations that are here for them in the preseason. So yeah. This question comes from @Herbie10MVP. What is Quentin Johnston's biggest game? I think when looking at this schedule, it's going to be interesting to see just how the rookies like get baked in under this Kellen Moore offense. The Chargers obviously like did not draft an offensive skill player super high last year. Isaiah Spiller kind of like was the guy, and obviously he didn't really like get going last year, and the coaching staff didn't trust him to do a whole lot. But you drafted a first round pick in Quentin Johnston, who Kellen Moore likes a lot. He's going to be baked into this offense doing something early on. The question is he going to be like the wide receiver, like 3, if you want to put it that way, by the time the season kicks off? Or is it going to take like 2 or 3 weeks before Quentin Johnston's like really integrated into that offense, right? I think in terms of like what Johnston's biggest game can be, like you're trying to look at a lot of the teams who struggled defensively, and specifically like struggle with speed defensively, because that's the way that you can kind of like get Quentin Johnston into like some, open space, whether that's through like an end around or something, or, even, just slant route a team to death, and then maybe Johnston breaks one off. I'm looking at the Vikings game a little bit. That's going to be early on in the season, and that's going to be Jordan Addison versus Quentin Johnston for all of the draft heads. I do think that could be a big Q game. I think you could look at the Cowboys game. Obviously, I think Quentin Johnston will kind of be turned up for that one. You could look at a lot of these games on the schedule. Maybe Quentin Johnston becomes truly the new Mike Williams and goes off in Arrowhead. That would be fun. But, for me, I think it'll take a couple weeks for Quentin Johnston to really be at like a peak performance type level. And I would say by week 3-4, by the bye week even, I think that's when we'll see like the real integration of Quentin Johnston into this Chargers offense. I wouldn't expect like incredible stat lines, I guess, out of those Dolphins like and Titans games to open the year. I do think it will take some time, I guess is what I'll say. Let's see if we have any other questions here. This comes from @Bolt1721. What stretch of games do you think is most difficult for the Chargers this season? So we've already talked about this a little bit, but I do think, you could go to that stretch of like Cowboys, Chiefs, Bears primetime game. I don't think the Bears are going to be as good as the league thinks they are. For me, I will say that like the most difficult stretch of games that I'm seeing is the one from the Chargers from week 9 to week 13. And I know there's no like divisional game in there, but you have the Jets on Monday Night Football at MetLife. You have the Lions, who again I do think are going to be ultimately like good. I don't think they're going to be like a dominant playoff team by any means. You have the Packers at Lambeau, Ravens Sunday Night Football with Lamar, who always plays fantastic on Sunday Night Football, assuming he's healthy, and then you go to Foxborough. I think that's a really tough stretch of games for the Chargers that maybe isn't being talked about like as much as some of these other stretches in the schedule that contain a Chiefs game or contain like a Cowboys game, or even the stretch that contains the Bills and the Chiefs again. But like that's a stretch where if the Chargers go 4-1 or 3-2, I think you're feeling really good about the team. But if they go 2-3 and like start to kind of fumble a little bit, and start to go backwards, then suddenly you don't feel as hot about the team. And obviously any stretch where you have 2 primetime games is probably going to be pretty hard. But yeah, that November stretch, I think we're going to learn a lot about who the Chargers are as a team, especially considering they don't have a bye week in that stretch. So it's just back-to-back weeks of football at that point. And I think you have some really tough opponents, teams, coaches, quarterbacks like in that schedule who are going to be looking to take the W there. And I think the Chargers are going to have a tough time. Let's see if we have any other questions. This comes from @Brandon Chrisman, who asks, what week does the Chargers offense start to hit its stride? This is kind of like the Quentin Johnston question a little bit, but I do think there's this like idea that the Kellen Moore offense probably isn't going to be firing on like all cylinders by week 1 or week 2. Like I think anytime you're installing a new offensive system, it's just going to take some time a little bit. But coming out of that bye week, like I expect the Chargers offense by week 6, week 7 to like really be in full force, and they kind of need to be. Like, it has to be a good offense by design. Like, and they have to score points. You have the Cowboys at home, which is going to probably be a shootout type game. And you have the Chiefs on the road at Arrowhead, which, I mean, the Chargers always play the Chiefs well, right? You can always peg that in as like a 30-27 overtime type game based on how things go, right? Or 33-27, whatever it ends up being. Like, that game probably turns into a bit of a shootout, and you have to have the offense to compensate for the fact that Patrick Mahomes is on the other sideline, right? So for me, when I'm looking at Kellen Moore's offense and like a target date for when it should be like in full force, it has to be by week 6 or week 7. And if it's not, I think the Chargers are kind of in big trouble if they're like still struggling with the offense by then. So yeah, for me, it's got to be by then. Let's see if there's any other questions. If not, I'll get you guys out. Matt asked the fun question where he asked if the Bills game on Peacock was actually going to turn me into being a Premier League fan. I will talk about the Peacock game for 1 second. I know people are calling that a primetime game, but is it a primetime game? Because it's on like the worst streaming platform. I just got to say it. I hate Peacock. Like, that is not. Also, it's bad of the league to put Herbert versus Allen on the Peacock app. And I know they're trying to advertise streaming services, but like, do what ESPN Plus did. Give me a Jags-Falcons game as an exclusive on ESPN Plus that I don't care about, but maybe I'll have ESPN Plus anyway and I'll decide to watch it. Because you know what? ESPN Plus is like a really good quality sports platform versus Peacock, not that. But don't put Herbert versus Allen behind a streaming service. Like, put another game there. Like, I don't want to see 2 top 5 quarterbacks just be locked down behind a streaming platform. So that's my rant about the Peacock game, which I'm not super excited for. But I think that'll do it for this Q&A. Got to all of your guys' questions. So as always, leave a like, drop a subscription if you want. See you guys next time. And as always, bolt up.